In 1544, Sher Shah Suri stood at the head of 80,000 elite troops as the undisputed emperor of Delhi. Yet as he looked across the sands of Giri Sumel at an enemy force a fraction of his size, the emperor did something unthinkable. He dismounted his horse, put down his sword, and began praying for his survival. This wasn't a standard military standoff. Sher Shah's massive Afghan army, equipped with heavy artillery and war elephants, was deadlocked against a smaller, highly disciplined force of Marwar Rajputs. On paper, the emperor held every advantage, but on the ground, he was paralyzed. The geography of the desert had turned his heavy equipment into a liability. Launching a direct offensive meant dragging armored cavalry and massive cannons across these shifting sand dunes. The terrain would likely swallow his formations before they ever reached the Rajput lines. Sher Shah realized that if he relied on physical combat, he was guaranteeing the destruction of his own ranks. To survive, he decided to abandon the battlefield of steel and move the conflict entirely into the minds of his enemies. The emperor's weapon of choice was information. He ordered his scribes to forge a series of secret letters and had them carefully dropped near the Rajput camp, ensuring they would be intercepted by King Maldev's intelligence network. These letters contained a calculated lie. They claimed that Jaita and Kumpa, the king's most trusted commanders, had secretly agreed to defect to the Afghans and assassinate the king in exchange for gold. The tactic was devastatingly effective. King Maldev, gripped by the fear of internal betrayal, ignored the pleas of his commanders. Under the cover of darkness, he abandoned the position and fled with the majority of his army. Sher Shah had achieved the impossible. Without firing a single shot, he had broken the Rajput alliance and cleared his path to victory by weaponizing a leader's distrust. Jaita and Kumpa woke up the next morning to an empty camp. Their king was gone, and their reputations were left in the dirt, branded with the stigma of treason. In their culture, living under such a shadow was a fate worse than death. To reclaim their names, the commanders and the few thousand men left behind turned to the ritual of Kesariya. Kesariya is a formal, ritualistic acceptance of mortality. The warriors wear saffron robes, perform their own last rites, and psychologically sever every tie to the world of the living. Once the saffron is worn, there is no plan for retreat. This mindset negates all standard military logic. These men weren't fighting for land, supplies, or even for their king. They were fighting for the singular purpose of dying with their honor intact. By forcing them into this corner, Sher Shah had accidentally created a force that could not be deterred or bargained with. These 10,000 men were no longer an army. They were a collective that had already walked into the afterlife. The Rajput warriors chose their moment when a blinding desert sandstorm swept across the flats. Using the dust as a shield, Jaita and Kumpa led their 10,000 men in a direct, high-speed charge against the 80,000 Afghans. Because they had no concern for self-preservation, they didn't pause for cover. They sprinted so fast that they crossed the kill zone before the Afghan artillery crews could even range their targets. The collision was chaotic and immediate. The two forces were jammed together so tightly that Sher Shah's numerical advantage vanished. In the crush of bodies, blades were more effective than cannons, and Jaita and Kumpa's men began carving through the Afghan front lines. The sheer aggression of the assault triggered a panic in the Afghan ranks. The 80,000-man force began to fragment and flee, terrified by an enemy that welcomed every strike. In his camp, Sher Shah watched his personal guards fall. It was at this moment that the emperor, the man who had just dismantled an army with a few letters, dropped to his knees in the blood-soaked sand to pray. The master of manipulation was now facing the one thing he couldn't lie his way out of. He had weaponized distrust to break the Rajput leadership, but he was now being broken by the sheer conviction of the warriors he left behind. Sher Shah's life was likely minutes away from ending when Jalal Khan arrived. He led a massive, fresh reserve of Afghan cavalry that had been held back from the initial chaos. The fresh cavalry hit the exhausted Rajput warriors from the rear. For men fighting since the storm began, this was a tactical death blow. The Rajputs were completely boxed in. With no space to move and no fresh momentum, the encirclement became a slaughter. They were killed to the last man, but they achieved their true objective. By the time the sun set, the record was clear. These men were not traitors. They had died defending the very king who had abandoned them. When the noise finally stopped, Sher Shah walked the field. He had won the battle, but he didn't look like a conqueror. He stood among the dunes and looked at the thousands of bodies. Most of them weren't Rajputs. They were his own elite Afghan soldiers, the backbone of his empire, sacrificed to kill a handful of men. Looking at the barren, low-yield land he had just secured at the cost of his army, Sher Shah spoke the words that would define the Battle of Giri Sumel. For a handful of millet, I almost lost the empire of Hindustan. Sher Shah walked away with the keys to Marwar, but Jaita and Kumpa walked away with the legacy. They proved that even the most massive imperial machine has no effective counter for a few thousand people acting on pure principle.